So, welcome everybody to this afternoon's meeting on the crisis in arms control and multilateralism. And let's get started. The organizers are on a tight schedule, and therefore we are. We have 45 minutes for discussion of an interesting and complex set of topics. My name's Dan Smith, and I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And what I'm going to do is introduce the wonderful panel that we have here. I'm going to make a few remarks, and then I'm asking the same question to each of the four panelists. Maybe we'll have, after they have each answered, maybe we'll have a little bit of comment back and forth between them. And then I'm hopeful that we can open up for questions and thoughts from the floor. There'll be roving microphone available to help with that. So sitting immediately to my left is my boss, and that's why I'm going to turn to him first when I ask questions and give him twice as much time as everybody else has. This is Stefan Löfven, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and now, amongst other things, Chair of the Governing Board of SIPRI. Sitting next to him is Woo Chun-si, who is Director of the Institute of International Strategic and Security Studies, which is part of the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, clearly in Shanghai, China. Sitting next along is Ambassador Wael Al-Assad, who is, amongst other things, the Senior Fellow at UNIDIR, the UN Disarmament Research Institute. And sitting beyond him is Renata Duan, who used to be Director of that same institute, and is, until recently, the special advisor in the UN Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. Now, here briefly is the situation as I see it. Like many other people, I'm extremely concerned about the situation that the world is in. I am older than I want to tell you, and I think that we are in the most dangerous period of my lifetime. And my lifetime goes back before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is how serious I think things are. I don't know if you all do at all, but I do each year pay a little bit of attention to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and its doomsday clock. The closer they set that clock to midnight, the worse they think we are. And it is now, it was set at the beginning of this year, at the closest to midnight that it has ever been. It'll be interesting to see in January whether they remain as gloomy as they were at the beginning of this year or gloomier. It's unlikely that they'll be feeling more optimistic and safer. And why is that? There are many reasons, too many to go into, ranging from the ecological crisis to military spending being higher than it ever has been, to 59 armed conflicts going on in the world involving states, and many more which are between purely non-state parties. Part of the picture is the risk of a new nuclear arms race unfolding and the crisis, effectively terminal crisis that we're in, of bilateral nuclear arms control between Russia and the USA. The one remaining arms control agreement between the two is the New START agreement, which runs out at the beginning of 2026, and there are no signs that we can see in public of negotiations to replace or even extend that treaty. Could be extended quite easily, but it is far, far from certain. There are weaknesses, unwelcome developments in other aspects of international arms control, multilateral arms control as well. And alongside of that, one has to see that these problems in arms control are in some ways simply a reflection of a toxic geopolitical situation, with rising confrontation and rivalry between the great powers. So that arms control, which is a subject that can be extremely technical, and in which, indeed, in order to get solid arms control agreements, one needs a great deal of technical expertise. This is a set of problems here which cannot be resolved purely technically. We have to think about the health of the multilateral system as a whole. We have to think about the health of the UN system, and we have to think about the nature of relationships between the great powers and amongst their respective allies as well. So with that, I want to ask each of the four panelists, first of all, for their take on this overall situation, as I've kind of myself briefly outlined it with a few headlines. And any hints which you're each able to offer about the way forward? Stefan, you first.
Thank you very much. Well, I think there's a number of factors that we have to include, and you touched upon them. But first is the geopolitical transition that we clearly can see. We used to have one superpower and a number of big powers or great powers, but one superpower. Now we have two that claim themselves to be the superpower number one in the world, and that creates new tensions, new uncertainty, and we see a number of countries gathering up around one of these two. You have Russia, of course, Venezuela, Cuba, Vietnam, around China, whereas you have others around US. Hopefully, still Europe remains to see after Trump is a new president. So that is one scene. The other, I think, is the long during a long time, we've seen the globalization work, and for me, globalization is both possibilities, but also risks and challenges. One is that we can clearly see we have an increased inequality in the world. It's domestic in most of the countries, but it's also international, and that creates tension in itself. Uh, the second one creates insecurity because people tend to see tend to be more insecure what happens with my life, what happens at home with my job, with my housing, and all that. Given this fast technological development, the globalization, we have technology now moving around, developing in a fast pace, but also capital moving around since a number of years. Um, that had meant it has been frustration among people, fear, anger, and it hasn't been met by a sufficient democratic balance. So, member states as nations, before you could take decisions that more steer your future, today that is much more difficult as a single member state. You need more of international decision making, and that hasn't really been developed yet. So, with that, we can see also a growing populism because all this insecurity and all that, of course, is used by autocrats, and they benefit, pointing out the insecurity, the challenges of this globalization, and all that also growing nationalism. So there's a chain, in my view, of things that we need to look into. And it boils down to really distrust or trust. Because with distrust comes, of course, a feeling we have to do something to protect ourselves, and we have to make sure that we have more of military equipment, more weapons, more bombs, and so on. Even nuclear. So even nuclear weapons have been higher on the agenda again from China is increasing. The whole world is, everybody's now, we see the number of nuclear warheads increasing again. Believing that that is a safety, security, which is not. It is not. We know that if they're used, it will damage the world, and still some believe that this is security. So we're having a number of increased on conflict, and I think all of them boils down to distrust instead of trust, and that the multilateral system doesn't really work as it should be. So that is common. And now we're in a false narrative that if we only can care about ourselves as a nation, we'll be safe. That'll be good. It's a false narrative, but it's easy to sell to your people because the other is much more complicated. So we need to change from this common distrust to common trust, and go for what was developed 40 years, more than 40 years ago, common security. How do we build common security? Knowing that if my neighbor is safer, I'm safer. And if my neighbor is unsafe, I will be more unsafe. So the leaders, it's a political leadership now, needs to have the message to the people saying, hey, the best way that we can develop our country is to include multilateral cooperation, and we have to develop that. That's the best way going forward. And we need people telling their leaders, hey, you go out there and cooperate and find a good multilateral structure so that we will benefit in our own country. I had the possibility of being co-chair of a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism before the Summit of the Future. I co-chaired it with the former, president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and we ended up in a report that we named "Breakthrough for People and Planet." So there is a possibility for us to have that breakthrough, thinking both planet, climate, environment, biodiversity, and people. They go hand in hand. So we need to create that new narrative where we can see the best way going forward is actually also to engage in the climate crisis, engage in the global finance architecture, and of course, peace and prevention. So I'll stop there.
Stefan, thank you so much for that overview. Chauncey, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank CIPRI and Doha Forum for giving me such a very good opportunity to join the forum and to have that kind of chance to learning and to exchange views related to arms control issues. I'm totally agree with that. We really see a very how to say dangerous situation in that kind of arms control area. I think we are not only met how to say one dimension crisis. We met actually four dimensions of that kind of problems. The first of all, we actually see the threshold of using nuclear weapons is moving down. And we see a lot of that kind of possible technical nuclear weapons, and people worried very much about that kind of situation. The so-called the nuclear taboo in that kind of Cold War actually is breaking. Secondly, actually, we see that kind of more non-nuclear weapon countries now become think maybe it is not bad or even good to have nuclear weapons. It seems a kind of proliferation of nuclear weapons. And thirdly, we see that kind of combination of conventional and nuclear weapons. It will very dangerous if in some kind of conflicting time you just cannot how to say know what is the conventional weapons and what is the nuclear weapons. And finally, I think we see some kind of new technology. We talk a lot about AI, all that kind of things. They will have some kind of implication, especially to that kind of command and the control system related to nuclear issues. So today we really face a very much complicated and dangerous situation in this kind of area. We need to address that kind of problem very seriously. But unfortunately, what even worse is that at least up to now, I have not seen that kind of real momentum to push forward that kind of arms control in a kind of new situation. So I believe that today's discussion is really very important, and I really want to learn more the new innovation or that kind of creative suggestion on how to deal with that kind of issue. Basically, I believe that multilateralism is a kind of, I think it might be a very good option for us, because definitely we see now the big countries stuck in that kind of so-called geopolitical competition. And I really, personally, I believe that they need some kind of help from that kind of international society to find some kind of way to provide a common agenda again on that kind of very important issues for the whole world. And also, I think multilateralism actually means two very important things. One is related to institutionalism. Previously, when we look at arms control international system or regime, we see a lot of institutions, but now most of them actually does not work anymore. So how can we just revive that kind of institutions? Will be very important. And the multilateralism also means medium, smaller country can have bigger voice in that kind of very important issues. So I think that today's topic is really very important. And I'm from China, and I think these days China, push forward. Trying to push forward the idea to the world of no first use of nuclear weapons. Of course, there's different views related to that kind of proposal, but I think China believes this is a very important step, or maybe just a first step to how to control the current worsening situation. So anyway, the world need to work together again on that kind of very important topics. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Wael Al-Assad, over to you now.
Thank you very much. And I would like to also to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this meeting for inviting me. Let me first make a slight differentiation between the crises that are attacking the multilateral structures that were erected after the Second World War, and between the crisis that is facing the disarmament and arms control mechanisms around the world. The crisis of multilateralism is born the day these institutions of multilateralism was born. The Cold War started immediately after the erection of these structures, and that has immediately affected these structures, starting from the Security Council, a paralysis that kept moving along these institutions and affected it. But arms control is different. Arms control worked sometimes during the Cold War because there was a realization that the two superpowers need to come to an agreement on certain arms control measures, otherwise the world can be in jeopardy. So there is a time difference. Once the Cold War ended, the real crisis of arms control, multilateral arms control, started to peer to the eyes. After the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, immediately, a few things happened that showed there are serious cracks in these institutions. And I've heard about the New Start dilemma, the withdrawal by both parties from the INF, but there are other multilateral agreements that are facing serious problems and affect the rest of the world as well. For instance, last year, the Russians revoked their ratification of the CTBT, saying that the United States has not done that over the last 10 years. And there is asymmetry here in this issue. I mean, that's a dangerous thing now that we are not seeing paralysis, but we are seeing reversal of the achievements that has been hard won over the years. The most important, in my opinion, is the paralysis of the review process of the NPT. The NPT is considered the most important arms control agreement through history, or so they used to say. And yet, it has been bombarded with a host of problems that almost paralyzed the process. There were always warnings that you cannot have two consecutive failures of the review conference. But this lately happened in 2015 and 2020. Why? Because the real powers in the game don't care anymore about making it a success. Everybody is part of this treaty, but it doesn't have to move forward unless they want to move it forward. So this paralysis put many of the middle powers and the smaller states in some sort of a quandrum. they realized that they are trapped with these treaties, but they are not moving forward on their issues, and the issues are not getting the proper attention. One of these issues relates to the Middle East. Since since '95, on the agenda of the NPT was the issue of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And although there has been promises, there has been statements, there has been literature inside the NPT, yet not one single movement happened in implementing what has been agreed upon in these conferences, because there are powers who do not want to move forward with that. So I don't want to take too much time. Please stop me when I reach. But after decades of globalization, the world is fragmented again. And we need to understand that geopolitical rivalry, protectionism, unilateral sanctions, and treaty withdrawals, and military and economic coercions. This is a major cracks in the system that I'm afraid we need to see. Would it work to mend it, or we need to start all over again? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Well. And then Renata, over to you.
Well, that's a cheerful start. It's hard to follow such desolate pictures, of which I agree with all of you. Maybe, though, I will offer a few thoughts. First, I think the crisis in arms control, everybody has talked about the nuclear crisis, and that's a really critical crisis because of the scale of potential devastation and the dangers that we see. And I think you all pointed to the nuclear modernization that all countries are undertaking, all nuclear possessors. You mentioned the proliferation crisis of countries taking seriously possibility of acquiring nuclear weapons. And essentially the bargain that was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was possessor countries saying to non-possessor countries, if you don't go for nuclear weapons, you can get access to nuclear technology for civil and peaceful uses. That bargain has broken down. And I think we need to ask ourselves specifically, why is that bargain breaking down? And part of the reason that bargain is breaking down was because the other part of the deal, which is often forgotten, was, and we will make a serious effort toward nuclear disarmament. So I think it's important to understand what was the political deal behind any agreement. But I'll move maybe just to the crisis of arms control, going a bit further than the nuclear space, because I think it's also in the conventional space. We are seeing the breakdown of what had been the most active area of arms control after the end of the Cold War. And that was essentially the discussion that the humanitarian impact of certain weapons was so cruel and so disproportional that the international community needed to come together. And that's what led to the Mine Ban Treaty. That's what led to the bans on cluster munitions. That's what led to the Arms Trade Treaty. So the progress in the post-Cold War world, as well you were implying, was actually in the conventional space, not particularly the nuclear space. And that is breaking down. We see in Ukraine the deployment of use by both sides of cluster munitions, known for their widespread and indiscriminate impact on civilians. We're seeing the Arms Trade Treaty being violated in the context of Israel and in the context of the war in Palestine. And we're also seeing the political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas being violated a mere couple of years after it's been agreed. And indeed, it was a non-binding agreement, but we're seeing that in Gaza every day. So I think we really need to extend our gaze to arms control crisis beyond the nuclear space, even though that continues to engage. And we need to look at the fact that I think one of the panelists mentioned the blurring of the conventional, the nuclear space. And we see that in Ukraine today and in Gaza with the use of drones, with the use of ballistic missiles, on which we have no arms control arrangements or restraint in place, or very few. We have some export control arrangements on missile technology. What do we do? I'll try to throw back to you, Dan, just a few thoughts. It seems to me that we need to first start to accept the notion that arms control agreements are snapshots in time. They capture a status quo arrangement, a power arrangement and dispensation as it is. We need to think about new ways of having restraint and agreements, which is that we don't try to freeze a status quo. We accept that we're going to have to be negotiating restraint and arrangements in the context of evolving power dynamics. So that might move us to then think about new tools, perhaps less focus on legally binding arrangements that often take years to negotiate and are capturing and solidifying a certain status quo or power arrangement. Perhaps we need to move towards norms and towards a suite of tools that allows for a much more sustained dialogue and conversation about inspections, transparency, reviews, discussions, how we understand a much more dynamic interaction with weapons, why they're being used, how they're being used, and how we evolve that norms of engagement. And I'll just add a final thought that I think that's going to become more and more important as we think about artificial intelligence, as we think about cyber technology, because we are definitely no longer talking about physical weapons where we can measure, where we can precise, where we can look at their payload, where we can look at their millimeters of size, but where we're looking at algorithms. And how do you regulate a non-physical instrument? How do you think about the navigation of that space? So I think that's going to be our challenge going forward. But I'll just end on a more hopeful note. Weil was right. Arms control is born not out of moments of greatness, but out of moments of tension. And can that precisely that bad moment be a driver for some of the ways of thinking about restraint?
Well, at least you got us out of the desolate moment, even if you left us then, which I think is necessary, with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions. So I really would like to hear a little bit from the audience, but I thought that I would try to challenge you each with about a minute or a minute and a half max, and keep your eye on the red numbers as they tick down. What to do? Okay, so Shansi, you mentioned the no first use principle. You talked about small and medium powers stepping up. Is there something there? Renate, you talked about going beyond the quantitative, basically, beyond counting into norms and principles and transparency. Can we think of like a permanent process of transparency, continual process of negotiation, which has not an end to the story with an agreement, but an end to a chapter with a kind of, a less formal something. Stefan, you talked about the problem of there being an easily sold fake narrative based on simplification. What's the alternative appealing? This is asking you to respond as a politician rather than thinking about, arms control as such. What's the potential for a headline to sell back instead of the easily sold fake narrative? And well, actually, Renata took the words right out of my mouth, because what I was going to say was that if arms control was born at that moment of crisis, is this actually the moment potentially when we turn the corner? So let me go in the same order down the line, starting with you, Stefan, finishing with Renata, and then see what the audience has to say. 60 to 90 seconds, go.
I think that we have to ground the multilateral cooperation as the opportunity to actually solve our problems. We have very, very complex challenges. It's not easy to solve, but we have to do it together. Nothing is being solved nation by nation. We have to do it together. And that is what I mean when I say leaders need to turn to the population and say, hey, the best way for us to go forward is, of course, to include a multilateral cooperation, because we are dependent on one another. The other thing I think we should do is to the right narrative of, let's say, the climate crisis is to attack it not only by reducing pollution, which is, of course, important in itself, but also by saying, hey, with this we will reduce pollution with net zero, and we will develop new technology, develop new jobs, And by that, we're both reducing pollution and building a better society. This is not an oak we are carrying around. This is the possibility. So instead of having a dark and very problematic narrative, give it a brighter so that people can see, watch in the future, say, yeah, this is a path we need to take and we need to cooperate.
Yeah, my response is like that. We are going into a kind of some new age. We face a lot of new things, and people always look forward. Actually, old things not always bad. So currently, I think especially nuclear powers need to stick to some kind of old principles. That's still very important for the world, just like no first use or not to use that kind of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapons. So at least in that kind of very, how to say, basic principles, nuclear weapons countries need to, how to say, reaffirmed their commitment to the world. And related to it is that I think nuclear weapons need to very restrained on that kind of role of nuclear weapons in their national defense strategy. So nuclear weapon states should not increase the importance of nuclear weapons in that kind of things. And but of course, more also very important. The whole world actually need to gain some kind of dialogues on that kind of new technologies. We need to prevent that kind of influence of new technology to the security and the safety of nuclear weapons. And finally, I would like to say that civil society, international civil society, will be very important. And these days, I think countries really have difficulty to how to say to produce some kind of a common agenda for themselves. And I think the international community will be very important to provide that kind of thoughts and to encourage that kind of the countries to sit together to provide some common thing that they can do together or in that kind of thinking. Yeah, I was.
Thank you. Of course, I agree that arms control was born out of necessity, it was not a luxury. And this is a moment of necessity as well, with only one reservation, that the leadership in the world now is different than the leadership which led arms control actually in the 50s and the 60s. I'm not sure they are aware of the importance of these issues. This is one of the issues of crisis in the multilateralism leadership. The second thing, yes, I agree. Medium powers and small powers play a role in pushing the bigger guys into a more moderate position of communication. Unfortunately, or I hope not, that middle powers are just seeking the privileges of the bigger guys, not playing the balance role they should be. So there is a lot of work that should be. The problem is, yes, as Renata said, what we call disruptive new technologies has surpassed our legal abilities at the multilateral level. And it's very controlled because you cannot control it, you cannot regulate it. And it has moved into other realms, as Renata said. So there is a lot of work that has to be done. One added thing I would like to do is to stress maybe one of the helping issues is regional agreements. That can somehow provide a basis for a more international, multilateral agreements. Thank you.
It's always hard to be last after everybody has said lots of thoughtful things. So the habit of conversation has stopped. Even in the worst days of the Cold War, the habit of bilateral dialogue was by and large maintained. That is currently not the case. Certainly, Russia and the US, China and the US, a little bit more, still not as much as it could be. So, reintroducing the habit of dialogue. I do think the discussions on risk reduction in the nuclear space amongst the nuclear powers, while insufficient, might be at least one way of preserving some of that discussion. On leadership, I agree with all the commentary that we face a crisis of leadership in arms control. And arms control is not a bottom-up exercise. And much as we can have champions on civil society, and the Mine Ban Convention was a product of civil society and arms control, the treaty the same, I think here we really need to think about leadership at a top-down as well as bottom-up. And there I would say that this is a moment for minilaterals. Some of the cross-cutting minilaterals that we have seen, Europe, Asia, Middle East, some of these plurilateral initiatives that are starting are going to be critical, I think, in taking forward some of these discussions. One thing I would want us to just bear in mind as a slightly more hopeful is I've heard a lot in these technology discussions, we need to agree principles for human oversight. We need to agree principles for responsible use. We have these principles, folks. We have them in the Convention on certain weapons. We have in the discussion of the AWS, the autonomous weapons systems. Those principles were agreed already in 2019, and we have those in many of our discussions. We have those principles for responsible use in the cybersecurity mechanisms, and the Global Digital Compact that was agreed, even if it's in the non-military domain, has agreed principles for responsible use of AI. What I think we're missing is a more holistic discussion that takes the arms control folks out of their very, very siloed box and brings them into the discussion with the scientists, the technical community, the multi-stakeholder community, and increasingly the interior public security functions. And perhaps that's the promise of artificial intelligence, the scope to actually have a more holistic discussion. So that would be one of my pleas, that we acknowledge what has happened on responsible AI, whether in the military space and some of the cyberspace, and seek to build a little bit on that, rather than maybe seeking to negotiate hard treaties in a time where that's not going to be accessible. And as for the interagency process, I'm struck in our national context. Work on potential national security and public security impact of AI technology sees countries bringing together all their ministries, their health, their education, their science, their defense, their police, homeland security, depending how you call it. We're not seeing that happen at the international level. We're reinforcing those silos. So that would be a pitch.
Great, thanks. Thanks to all four of you for rising to that challenge. We have just a few minutes in which we could take a quick round of questions, gather them together and see what the panel is able to come back with. Don't expect that your complex four-part question will A, be accepted, or B, answered. I saw a hand go up there, one here, and one there. We've got time for four.
Salah Patel, formerly of Amnesty International. I'd like to ask the panel about commercial interests here. And I wonder if talking about this topic without talking about that is a bit like talking about climate change without talking about the oil companies and the lobbying that they're doing and the interests that they have. So yeah, I'd just like to ask the panel for their meditations on weapons manufacturers and their role in what's going on in the world today.
Thanks very much. If you could randomly pick out one of the hands that will be shooting up, right? One there. That's going to be two from that side, and then there'll be two from here. Please stand and introduce yourself, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Muzin Lohu. I wanted to find out, given the context that basically the arms conversation in the last 20 or 30 years has shifted from a conversation of disarmament to more of regulated armament, how we can shift back the needle to the former conversation, given that we all agree that regulated armament in one way or another is likely to give us a crisis, maybe not today, but sometime soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And one over here. Yes, gentlemen.
Syed Masha from Pakistan, legal academic and lawyer. I wanted a quick review, maybe whoever wants to take this, on the aspect of lawfare. And most importantly, of course, another weapon of mass destruction that's being used practically, which is drones and the arms control on drones. And if Stefan, if you could just say a few comments on the EU's itself was created on the basis of controlling supplies for war, coal agreement. how that may role, particularly in critical minerals. Thank you.
And one more on this side, if somebody puts their hand up quickly. Yep.
Yes, hello. My name is Cal Farid. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar. So I'm not, this is not my area of expertise. However, I wanted to bring a little bit of a political aspect into this. So I think, Mrs. Vu, you could be helpful in this mission. So basically, we know, as we've spoke, we're basically reaching the new regional trend of countries being more nationalistic than multilateralism. One of the issues that I was interested in is basically how can East Asia, like China, Japan, and Korea, reach some kind of regional stability? As we know, for example, I'd like to use a case study such as Japan. Japan, as we know, since it fell in the World War and it being under America, San Francisco Treaty has been signed, in which Japan is treated as a pacifist country. You know, no arms race. They're not going towards nuclearism until Shinzo Abe became a prime minister, and we can see a little bit of a shift of where, especially with the South China Sea issue, because Japan basically putting your soldiers outside, slowly moving towards nuclear. And I know there's a lot of disputes between, like the shrine issue between China, Japan, as well as Korea and Japan. All of these issues that makes it hard for these three countries to make like a council similar to GCC. So what kind of approach do you see possible in countries not actually arms trade race and try to find a way to connect and make an established council if possible?
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to disappoint everybody else. Time is always the enemy when we're having meetings like this. So quite wide range of questions, commercial interest, a shift back to disarmament, arms control on drones and such technologies, origins of the EU and East Asian regional stability. I expect none of you to answer more than one of those because you only have a minute or everybody's going to get very grumpy. Let's do it in reverse order. Renata, you were complaining about being last, so be first.
Thank you to the speaker from Amnesty on the reminder of commercial interests. It's true that we haven't brought that up enough, and that's a key aspect in the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, was one of the big actors. I would only say that I think the future of arms control is going to depend on bringing private sector actors into the room. For a couple of reasons. First, they are now often leading in the development of these technologies. Second, we're seeing partnerships between departments of defense, formal partnerships, and technology companies. And third, we're going to have to rethink how we think about the specifications and restraints. So I do see an argument for understanding them as actors with agency in the space, as you described, and how we think about bringing them into the room rather than excluding them room, which is also excluding them from their own responsibilities for engaging in this.
Now, would you give me one of these questions? Because I have a hearing deficiency. I couldn't hear the questions clearly.
I think the one that I would pick out for you, Veil, is it possible now to think about, and if so, how can we think about shifting away or more than just the agenda of regulating arms control, to actually an agenda or at least an objective of disarmament? Yeah. Is that a possibility, and if so, how?
It's a difficult proposition, of course, because it has always been about arms control and rather than disarmament. But the treaties for disarmament are there, but they are not effective. They are not active. We will not get anywhere with these treaties unless, as we said many times, the medium states, medium powers and smaller states can push the agenda for disarmament. Renata mentioned in the beginning the Article 6 of the NPT, which is a promise that has never been fulfilled, which is the backbone of the treaty, actually, and yet it was never fulfilled. So unless you push for your rights, you will get nowhere. The smaller states are paying a heavy price for this paralysis of disarmament. But of course, disarmament is a must if we need to move forward. But also arms control arms limitation between big powers
is essential and has always been the part of these treaties. Thank you.
Yeah, as to the East Asia issues, I see Professor Yan Shetong of Tsinghua University is here. I remember that in the earlier session of this today, he mentioned about the role of United States in regional affairs. I think it's very important topics. And actually, I hope Japan and South Korea have some kind of bigger rooms, space to talk about that kind of regional issues. And I'm a supporter of China, Japan, South Korea talk on regional issues. And I think we can even broaden that kind of issues related to East Asia. East Asia really needs some kind of regional security arrangement. I mean, the fundamental reasons of that kind of arms race or that kind of build-up of arms related to insecurity, all countries feel like that way. So we need some kind of regional security arrangements to make all countries in that kind of region to feel a little bit away from that kind of concerns. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Steph.
So I'm ready to distrust or trust because several of these issues, questions is about that. One agreement was about building trust between nations in Europe. So that is one thing. The open manufacturing, yes, they will be there as long as there's a demand. As long as there's a political demand for weapons, more weapons, there will be someone manufacturing them. We can think about that. We can think it's unethical and immoral, but it's a fact. So we have to build trust to reduce the demand for weapons. On disarmament, finally, yes. I mean, there is a place here in West Europe now. We're thinking a lot of how can we make sure that Ukraine wins this war. It doesn't require disarmament of Ukraine right now. It demands something else for the long term sake. But of course, we need to change that. Also, think long term. How do we change the situation into something where we can build trust and understand this is not the long term sustainable solution? We need to go into disarmament. But one perspective, I do think we need to talk about disarmament directly, and that is nuclear weapons. Because if we have a huge risk with climate change, which we have, this one is here and now. Every minute, every breath we take, nuclear weapons are there as a risk. So that I would like to see a new movement against nuclear weapons.
Stefan, thank you very much, and thank you all four. I think you've been heroic. Well referred to the idea that arms control was born out of a moment of necessity. And of course, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that invention is what we want. How would we come about that invention? For example, the question of Northeast Asia that was raised. Well, we need to think about ways in which it's possible for the countries there, the governments, to be developing a regional framework or architecture, even in an informal sense, for securing their relations with each other or advancing their relations in a safe way. In order to do that, they and the rest of us have to turn to what Renata was saying about renewing the habit of conversation. And it's only if we renew the habit of conversation that maybe then other regional agreements, as Wael said, come into play. And as Chun-Si was talking about then, within that, think about what the principles are which have been established before and which are still valuable even in a changing situation. Best invention, it seems to me, always builds something new on what's worthwhile of the old. And then I think that one of those principles that has come through clearly in the conversation is that cooperation is the way forward. There is almost no major problem that is being faced: climate change, pandemic risk, crime, the need for stability in international trade, let alone peace and disarmament. Almost no way forward for a single government alone. We have to relearn the habit of cooperation. And on that note, which I hope is an optimistic one, I'll say thank you very much to the panelists. I hope you'll join me in thanking them, and thank you very much to you for your attention.